Welcome to the presentation, Writing Proficiency of Heritage Language Learners, a Genre-Based Informed Approach. The content of this presentation is the result of an ongoing research project which intends to evaluate the efficacy of genre-based pedagogy to promote literacy development in heritage language learners. My name is Alberta Gatti, and I am working on this project with Dr. Sayel Graves. We both work at the Institute for Language Education in Transcultural Context, ILTEC, housed at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. During this presentation, I will provide a brief rationale for why it makes sense to use genre-based informed curriculum if the goal is heritage language literacy development. Then I will present a very succinct overview of genre-based pedagogy. I will share the structure of a literacy development curriculum for Spanish heritage language learners constructed using genre-based principles by taking a look at the general structure and then providing more detail on each of the components as they are realized in a version of the curriculum for learners with intermediate level of proficiency in writing. Proficiency in this presentation refers to the ACTFL guidelines 2012. I will finish with a summary and a quick comment on the evaluation of this new curriculum. On the handout that accompanies this presentation, you will find time estimates for each item on this agenda. Let's begin. Why genre-based pedagogy for heritage language education? The heritage language education field is in agreement that to serve the unique needs of heritage language learners, we should implement macro-based curricula in our heritage language courses. If you're not familiar with the difference between macro and micro-based approaches to language instruction, I highly recommend Maria Carreira's 2016 chapter on the topic. You will find a complete citation in the handout for this presentation. As Carreira points out, in macro-based approaches, language development is dictated by function and context. And all the work, including the acquisition of metalinguistic knowledge, takes place at the level of discourse instead of taking place at the sentence level. Since macro-based approaches work from and with text in context, they are easily aligned with critical language approaches and also allow for the recognition and validation of what the learners bring to the teaching learning task. Many pedagogical approaches are considered micro-based. For example, community-based language learning, and you can find many publications on the use with heritage language learners. Cultura type virtual exchanges, one of my favorite, for which you can check out the Cultura site. And for an implementation with heritage language learners, you can see the ILTEC's own work with Spanish and Chinese heritage language learners. We also have project-based language learning, a lot of work done by Maria Carreira on this, and also a lot of resources on the National Foreign Language Resource Center site. More recently, pedagogical models that follow the New London Group's multiliteracy pedagogy have been constructing curriculum for heritage language learners. You can look at the work by Maria Luisa Parra. And yes, genre-based language learning, for which in the US there is extensive work done for German as a second language, but not much else for other languages, or in particular for heritage language learners. While all of these pedagogical approaches are well suited for literacy development, both multiliteracy pedagogy and genre-based have been created for literacy development. More on literacy later on. Now we are going to look at what is genre-based informed pedagogy. To answer this question, I will conduct a brief review, very brief review of the history and principles of genre-based pedagogy. One disclaimer before I proceed. For the sake of brevity and clarity, I will be taking some liberties with the terminology used within genre-based pedagogy, and I apologize for this in advance. Genre-based pedagogy stems from a complete theory of language known as systemic functional linguistics that has its origin in the work of linguist Michael Halliday. Systemicists are interested in grammar as a meaning-making resource. They understand language as a social semiotic and study how people use language with each other to accomplish everyday social life. Because of its semiotic nature, language allows speakers and writers to make 3 types of meaning simultaneously. When we speak and write, we communicate what's happening, which Halliday called ideational meaning. But we also establish relationships with the reader or the other speakers, or between the participants and between the participants within the texts we are creating. This type of meaning was called interpersonal meaning. And at the same time, we organize information in specific ways, which is called textual meaning. Finally, speakers or writers enact each of these types of meaning by making choices. For instance, to appraise a story that we are telling, we might choose to include how we feel about it, to signal our commitment to the story, or to evaluate it. And within each of these choices, more specific choices can be made as represented in this taxonomy. More recently, a group of systemic linguists known as the Sydney School of Linguistics worked on identifying how meaning is made in the types of texts that children attending school in Australia are required to write. These linguists looked for global patterns in the text, and they called these patterns genres. They defined genre as a staged, goal-oriented social process. Genres are staged because it takes more than one step to reach a goal. The same way it takes several steps to hang a picture, it takes several steps to tell a story. Genres are goal-oriented because they have evolved to get things done. The goal of a biography, for example, is telling life stories, but the goal of a typology is to classify differences and etc. as we go with different types of genres. And genres are social processes because they are co-constructed by members of specific linguistic communities. We are not imposing genres on learners. Instead, we are helping them learn how specific linguistic communities construct them. The same way, grammar is a system of choices, as we saw with the taxonomy of appraisal. Genres are also systems of choice. Depending on what we want to accomplish, speakers or writers make different choices, as illustrated here with the taxonomy for stories. Text structure stories give us news stories, but time structure ones become recounts or counter-expectant time structure stories, what in systemic functional linguistic terms, we would call a story with a complication. If the complication is resolved, we have a narrative. If unresolved, we have the options. Interpreted, that gives us an example. Reacted to gives us an anecdote, or commented on gives us an observation. Similar taxonomies were developed for other genres as well. Let me emphasize that these taxonomies were the results, as Halliday's grammar of English was, of observing and describing what actual people do with language. And it's important to add that both functional grammar as well as genre theory were developed within educational contexts. These are language theories for education toward literacy. To summarize, in a genre-based model, learners work with texts in context instead of working with discrete sentences or texts taken out of context. Instead of vaguely prompting learners to write a recount, for instance, we can identify for them what a recount does, through which stages it does it, and the language choices writers or speakers make when creating recounts. Additionally, for us in the language acquisition business, the genre taxonomy presents us with the means to structure curriculum that is sensitive to the linguistic resources of learners at the start of the course. For example, a course for intermediate level writers will concentrate on storytelling genres, moving from first-person recounts to third-person narratives, stories with a complication, to historical genres, so to develop advanced level language. Instead of exposing these learners to genres that require deploying linguistic resources that are 2 levels above their current proficiency abilities, like reports and explanations. To close this section of the presentation, let's quickly revisit the teaching and learning cycles typically used within genre-based pedagogy. The cycle starts with a deconstruction activity, during which learners are shown how meaning is made in contextualized texts. This is followed by a joint construction activity, where instructor and learners work together in creating a new text within the targeted genre. And finally, this activity is followed by independent construction, where learners create their own texts. For the new curriculum model I will share with you in a minute, I have used a modified version of this cycle, but it makes sense to take a look at the original model because it gives a good visual of how work on understanding meaning and producing meaning are intrinsically linked in this model. And I keep that connection. It's just that the cycle, it's a little bit different. Let's proceed now to the third part of this presentation, the overall structure of a curriculum for heritage language learners constructed from the principles just summarized. The overall goal of this curriculum is literacy development, where literacy is understood following Richard Kern's definition as the use of socially, historically, and culturally situated practices of creating and interpreting meaning through texts. Literacy entails engaging critically with contextualized texts in all modalities, recognizing its variation across time and discourse communities, which is extremely important for working with heritage language learners. As you can see, this notion of literacy goes well beyond the ability to read and write. Instead, it entails engaging learners with three interrelated dimensions: linguistic dimensions, sociocultural, and cognitive and metacognitive dimensions. In order to make this overarching goal manageable and measurable, it has to be further converted into discrete, measurable learning objectives within each dimension, which, once developed depending on the context in which one is working, they might look something like this. Now that we defined literacy, let's take a look at how this model is structured to promote development. Development within this model is set in motion through three components, all three articulated from the perspective of the learner. The first component entails extended discourse reading, the second, deconstruction, and the third, writing. The three components, while working from and on different skills, are deployed concurrently and in an overlapping fashion. In this model, work within one component builds upon and informs the work within the other two, in a very overt fashion. So extended discourse reading informs the construction and writing, the construction informs reading and writing informs reading and deconstruction. We can think of these three components as three threads of a wire twisted together and spiraling upwards and outwards as the course progresses, turning and moving up as existing and developing literacy resources are deployed and repurposed. Let's take a closer look at how each component is realized in activities. For this portion of the presentation, I will use a version of the pedagogical model designed for a college heritage language course with learners whose proficiency in writing ranges between intermediate low and advanced low. And because of this, the linguistic development target for this specific realization of the course is functional abilities at advanced, narration and description in detail in all major timeframes with good control of aspect on topics of general interest. To get there, storytelling genres articulate the work. Let's start with the extended reading component. What do we do? What do we read? For these components, learners are assigned a longer text, about 350 pages, which they will read in its entirety, a pre-assigned numbers of chapters each week, starting week 1 and ending at the last week of the semester. For this proficiency level, as we mentioned, from the option within storytelling genres, I selected an autobiography. On a topic with familiar connections to the specific learners enrolled in the course, facilitating the otherwise quite complex task. Let me spend a minute explaining why this component is here. Reading a longer text in the heritage language, a key advanced literacy ability, is an experience that most heritage language learners have not had. And the context of the course provides them with the support and scaffolding required to do it, even for the lower proficiency readers. This type of reading demands a cognitive engagement with the text that is quite different from the required when engaging with shorter texts. Readers have to build up information, connect with content from previous chapters, make predictions based on previous information, etc. It provides also a substantial quantity of input on the targeted topic. Now let's see how we read. The reading is done asynchronously on a collaborative reading platform where learners engage with the text, but also with their peers and the instructor. The reading activity is low stakes. Grading criteria is based on consistent, timely engagement with the text throughout the semester within certain parameters set by the instructor. For instance, how many annotations readers need to include each week, if they need to address instructor questions, etc. And what do we do when reading? As highlighted earlier, identifying existing resources is a key goal of the curriculum. While identification of resources is not a once and done task, to get an initial idea of what learners can do, learners complete a quick diagnostic activity to self-assess fluency and comprehension before starting reading. From there, learners develop their reading abilities by working on sustained reading, weekly reading, while commenting on the experience of reading and responding to questions the instructor introduces, which target the specific literacy goals of the course. These questions direct readers to connect what they do when reading with the construction and writing activities they have performed, are performing, or will perform in this course according to discrete literacy goals. For instance, at a point in the course, learners work on first identifying narration and description, and then understanding how storytellers use description. During this portion of the semester, for the extended discourse reading activity, the instructor asks learners to identify descriptions in the chapters they are reading and to think how these descriptions are used in the construction of the story. Are they used as background information or to point out to feelings, values, etc.? Learners answer the instructor's questions to the best of their abilities, depending on the individual literacy experience of the learners and the novelty of the question. Have they already encountered the issue in previous activities? Learners will either rephrase what's in the text or be able to move beyond restating to adding by commenting, explaining, etc. Learners are also prompted to initiate comments about their experience as readers and the strategies they employ when they read. This type of reading gives the instructor the opportunity to both acknowledge learners' efforts and abilities, providing much needed reassurance for learners who tend to experience linguistic insecurity. And at the same time, it gives the opportunity for the instructor to redirect learners' thought according to the course goals. We move now on to the second component, deconstruction. The second component is text deconstruction, and it's used to show learners in a very explicit fashion how what others do when they write. For this specific realization of the model, remember that the target is advanced language. Texts for analysis include shorter recounts and chronicles organized for increasing length and complexity, always recycling and expanding. We start with very short first-person recounts that were crafted from oral texts, then progress to longer first-person recounts to third-person chronicles, moving away from orality. Deconstruction activities, as in the case with reading and writing, take place every week of the semester. Using guiding questions, learners are asked to work with texts first independently, so they test how well they can apply to new texts what they already know. Then learners and the instructor collaborate in an in-depth deconstruction, which includes explicit teaching of new concepts. A typical deconstruction starts with the context of publication. Where is the text published? Where is the text published? By whom? For whom? Why? Then moves to the level of genre, looking at genre patterns, the goal of the specific genre, and how it is achieved through the stages in the particular text. And finally, we zoom into the level of language in the text to understand how language is used to tell what happens, the ideational meaning, how the writer establishes relationships with a reader, and how the participants relate to each other within the text, interpersonal meaning, and finally, how the text is constructed, the textual meaning. A text after the construction activity might look something like this. In this example, I'm showing you the construction of a recount. Recounting takes 3 stages: the orientation, the events, and the reorientation. So first, we review what the writer typically does in each of these 3 stages, and then we identify these stages on the text we are analyzing. Then we identify particular linguistic moves used to tell what happens. For instance, what type of verbs are used, or in the systemic functional linguistic vocabulary, what type of processes, and how the writer appraises the story, for instance, through modification. Finally, we look at how the writer has organized the story, and in this case, by both fronting verbs at the start of each stage, but also as well by establishing location for the actions, which we found with our web readers is a pattern that emerged after reading a few migration recounts. As you can see, in order to do this work, learners need to acquire meta-linguistic knowledge and the vocabulary to go with it. We move now to the third and final component, writing. Writers write within the genres targeted so they can learn and practice how to mean in these specific genres. Intermediate level writers work on narration in all time frames and on controlling aspects through the writing of a personal recount and a chronicle, moving from first to third person narration. As with extended discourse, reading and with the construction activities, learners write every week of the semester in class and outside class. The crafting of each text takes about half of the semester. We use a writing workshop model that was developed for K-12 education by Lucy Hawkins and her team at the Teachers College at Columbia University through a cycle of explicit teaching, independent writing, and reflection that I will explain in a minute. So what is it's taught comes mostly from genre-based pedagogy, but how it's taught comes from this model of the writing workshop. When we write, we identify existing resources at the start of the semester. Learners self-rate their writing abilities using can-do statements and complete a writing proficiency assessment modeled after the ACTFL writing proficiency test. Knowing at the start of the semester what writers can and cannot yet do helps them and the instructor set goals for the semester. And I found it reduces the anxiety of heritage language learners who are not used to writing in the heritage language. Writing activities are purposefully connected to the construction activities, and more loosely to extended discourse reading activities. The same linguistic and text organization elements are targeted for the construction and for writing. For instance, learners are deconstructing recounts at the same time that they are writing their own recounts, focusing on similar linguistic and text organization choices in both. Let's take a closer look at the writing workshop model. Each week, the instructor spends time teaching one or a few writing targets for the week. She does this by very explicitly telling what she will teach and then showing writers how she does it in a text that she's composing at the same time learners are composing theirs. For instance, the instructor explains what appraising a story is and then shows learners how she includes appraisal in her own recount. Then writers have time to work on their own texts during class with instructor available to assist them. Following the example just given, learners focus on appraisal in their own recounts. Have they included it or not? Where? How? Is it effective in establishing the desired connections with their readers? After some time of independent work, the class reconvenes as a group for a brief sharing on how the work went, what was difficult, how they went about completing the task. This cycle is repeated weekly, as many times as needed to address all the targets set for the portion of the semester. The number of sessions depends on the number and complexity of these targets or goals. Once all the goals have been explained and integrated, writers submit a final draft, which will receive more traditional feedback from the instructor, including editing the grammar that learners are still developing and cannot edit on their own, and making suggestions on issues we did not target during this period of the semester. Once writers incorporate instructor feedback, the final copy is published either on a class site or on a more public venue. I mentioned targets and goals that are taught first and then implemented by writers. Well, these goals are shared with writers on a checklist introduced at the start of the process and then used throughout. The checklist details what the instructor will be teaching. For text development, it contains descriptors aligned with the 3 types of meanings mentioned before: how the writer addresses what happens in the recount, how the writer establishes relationships with the reader and between participants in the text, and how the text is organized. Learners use this checklist to monitor their work. Using it makes writers accountable for their work from the very start of the process, as they learn to identify what they can do and what needs development. Besides development targets, the checklist also includes a section on targeted writing convention and editing strategies. For instance, in this version, writers are made accountable for the use of proofreading tools when writing in Spanish, using proper capitalization in the language, using question marks and exclamation points, and accent marks for high frequency words that might appear on a personal recount, like mama and mama, the difference between mama and mama, papa and papa. And finally, let me add that the checklist expressly aligns with the rubric that will be used to assess the final draft of the recount. Basically, they are the same document, but phrased differently. Instead of saying I use resources, it will say the writer used resources. Well, then let's summarize what we just explained of how this curriculum is structured and how it addresses literacy development. The goal of this genre-based pedagogical model is literacy development, where learning outcomes reflect the simultaneous development of linguistic, sociocultural, and cognitive abilities. All the work is done from, through, and with text in contexts. Learners see how actual texts that live in the world of specific linguistic communities are structured, are constructed, and used. They get to become active members of that community with their own reading and writing practices. The way the curriculum is structured using genre takes into account existing resources, including proficiency level, starting proficiency level of learners. And development is prompted through three components: extended discourse reading, deconstruction, and writing. And the three are very intentionally connected through a highly scaffolded process with plenty of explicit teaching, but also plenty of time to engage in working with text. I wanted to share with you that data collection from the pilots that use this curricular model will be analyzed in the next 9 to 12 months. At that time, we will have information to share with you on the curriculum effectiveness as it relates to potential for literacy development. So stay tuned and visit our site for news about the evaluation of the curriculum. And now, with this, we have reached the end of our presentation, hoping that it will generate some ideas for your own work with heritage language learners. We want to thank all of those who worked and are working with us in this project, and especially all of you who listened to this presentation. We welcome your questions, comments, and suggestions. Thank you very much.